It was the Victorians who cherished the idea of home as a domestic haven. They coined the phrase "safe as houses," and in this age of invention, homes were bursting at the seams with new gadgets, products, and conveniences. In the bedroom were the latest beauty products and manufactured clothes, while in the nursery, the toys were brand new and factory-produced. And for the first time, the stove warmed the entire house, the original home sweet home. But there was a problem. Many of the exciting products and appealing innovations they welcomed into their homes were not just health hazards, they were killers. And with the aid of science, seek out these domestic assassins, their houses were disgusting. I'll be revealing what the Victorians couldn't see inside their homes. These things undoubtedly would have killed many children, and showing the terrible injuries that were inflicted in the name of progress. What you need to do is move your bust up. Okay, and I'll feel the strain of chasing the Victorian ideal. Welcome to the perilous world of the real Victorian home. In the second half of the 19th century, cities exploded to house the booming middle classes. In just over 50 years, their number grew from 2.5 million to over 9. And these new urban middle classes took immense pride in their homes. They had money, and they wanted to spend it on making their houses cozy havens of donnas to steam and comfort. Not for these people, the grim perils of Victorian factory life, or the gritty reality of the overcrowded streets. The sort of family who lived here enjoyed a level of comfort and luxury previously unknown to ordinary people. The cost of necessities fell dramatically, and new mass production techniques made goods available and affordable. This meant a level of conspicuous consumption never witnessed before. They filled their rooms with things that made the house a home. They've been inspired by the Great Exhibition of 1851, which showcased the latest and the best in gadgets and consumer goods. What had been happening now for the best part of 100 years suddenly crystallized in this extraordinary exhibition. It was and so much that he was new as it was, just suddenly boom in bulk as the century went on and consumerism began to increase. One of the fascinating things is that the phrase standard of living first appeared for the first time in history. You measured how good your life was by how many objects you possessed when you think about it. That is actually a very strange idea. You could not just buy anything what wasn't. Tasteful was discussed at length in the many, in various new household guides and magazines. John Ruskin, the leading art critic and social theorist, impressed on Victorian consumers the importance of making the right choices. Good taste is essentially a moral quality. What we like determines what we are, and to teach taste is inevitably to form character. Yet while the Victorians fretted about abstract notions of morality, they were oblivious to the real dangers that came from things they had welcomed into their houses. Every room in the Victorian home was filled with hidden killers, and one of the most dangerous places was the drawing room. The Victorians were really rejecting the idea of the 18th century classicism, the restraint, the delicacy, the white walls that was, although that they wanted clutter, they wanted color, they wanted accessory. They really furnished to show that for them, color and clutter and objects, that was wealth. And that was importance, and that was breeches. One thing that particularly indicated both good taste and status was wallpaper. The richer the pattern and the darker, more vivid the color, the better. Why? Because with the introduction of gas lighting for the first time in history, there was enough light in the house for ordinary people to have and enjoy intense color on their walls. As a result, there was something of a wallpaper. Craze manuals like Castle's Household Guide, which told the Victorians how to do everything, outlined principles of good taste, and told them which patterns of wallpaper to buy. They were influencing a massive market. Wallpaper sales had shot up from around 1 million pieces a year in 1834 to 32 million by 1874. Castle's even gifts what its cause, its theory of color. It describes his rules for the artistic appreciation in dress and furniture, and it recommends green. It calls it a color of repose. Says the eye experiences a healthy and peculiarly grateful impression from this color, as opposed to something like yellowish red, which it says is the preference of impetuous, robust men and savage nations. A particularly brilliant green, known as Sheila, as green was all the rage. Scheele was the Swedish scientist who first mixed the pigment to produce an intensely vivid color that didn't fade. Its incredible popularity meant that it was used in everything from carpets, Barrymore's, candles, and children's toys, but most of all it was used in industrial quantities in wallpaper. There was one strange coincidence as wallpaper sales escalated. So did reports of unexplained deaths and illnesses in the home. But there was nothing mysterious about it. The magic ingredient. That was giving the wallpaper its rich green hue was arsenic. These were samples of what would be considered tearful wallpapers to have in a Victorian home. This on the walls would have been loaded with arsenic. Actually, in the printing of the book, it's also used, or cynical dyes. See, this book that you've shown me now has asked the confused Miss Christmas. There's quite a lot of arsenic in this it. It's not, I don't believe what you're saying, but could you prove it? It's fairies you do. If I use this instrument, which is a portable XRF, it tells us what contaminants, metallic contaminants are present, and items basically consisted. Offices got large amounts of copper in it. We've got large amounts of arsenic in it. Yes, the actual salts used in this pigment, or copper arsenic, and this book probably I'll wash my hands afterwards. Modern science can prove the Victorian wallpaper contained arsenic, but this danger wasn't fully understood at the time to confuse matters further. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning were very similar to cholera, which had been rampant in Britain in living memory. The immediate effects would be of pain swelling of the esophagus, very dry throat, and difficulty in swallowing, and then what's described is agonizing abdominal pains as the whole digestive tract is affected by the arsenic vomiting diarrhea, and sounds terribly unpleasant, and then people would die, which was said to be quite a relief because it was such an agonizing way to die. Newspaper headlines continued to report mysterious illnesses and deaths, and links were made with arsenic in the second half of the 19th century. The newspapers are full of cases like this. One 6-month-old child dies as a result of chewing on a piece of emerald green wallpaper, but even if you hadn't eaten the wallpaper, you weren't safe. In fact, the wallpaper was endangering the health of the nation in another hidden and much more insidious way thanks to a chemical reaction. Poisonous fumes are thought to have infiltrated the very air they were breathing. There's a lot of bit about the production of arsenic gases from the wallpaper. The actual surface of the wallpaper, predictive lock wallpapers could come off, and your house would be covered in arsenical dust, but also in Victorian houses, which were centrally heated. The relatively damp you put, dumped together with wallpaper paste and cellulose, which is another wallpaper itself. And you got fungal growth, and as many fungi can actually roll out lies, those are cynical salts, and they're a volatile form of arsenic, and they are highly toxic. These things were billowing out arsenic in the home in which obviously the windows were hardly ever opened because of the smog. They sat there in this lovely ferg of arsenic, thinking they're in this perfect, virtuous, healthy home. It does not actually matter how the arsenic is absorbed into the body. Whether you breathe it in, whether it comes in through the skin or the other membranes, or whether you actually eat it, it actually has a very similar effect because it's effective via the bloodstream. So the arsenic gets into the bloodstream and travels around the body. But one of the problems with the slower arsenic poisoning of a small amount over a longer time is that it could cause very vague symptoms. And obviously, if you're being poisoned by something in a particular room of the house, and when you left that room, you got a bit better, it could come and go. And so it was much harder to differentiate it from other illnesses thought around. At the time, some doctors began to question the use of arsenic in wallpaper as more and more mystery deaths were reported in the home. The Lancet, too, took up the cause. There appears good reason for believing that a very large amount of sickness and mortality among all classes is attributable to this cause, and that it may probably account for many of the mysterious diseases of the present day which so continually baffle all medical skill. In 1856, a couple in Birmingham reported to their doctor, Dr. Hines, that they were suffering from inflamed eyes, headaches, and sore throats. Even their pet parrot was drooping. They decided to go on holiday to the seaside, and there, Symptoms disappeared. They suspected something in their house, and they had recently applied bright green wallpaper to 2 rooms at home. Dr. Hines wondered if that alone could be responsible for their ailments. People went to the seaside and took the waters and took the spa. What effectively they were doing is moving out of a toxic environment into a healthy diluted environment where you had fresh air water that came from a known source, not relying on what was in a concentrated area within the property. They moved away from a toxic environment. What's really astounding is how much arsenic there was in a Victorian drawing room when you add up all the materials that contained arsenic pigment. Certainly, we know that it was a huge amount of arsenic in, say, Victorian living room, which had 100 square meters surface area, could contain up to 2.5 kilograms of arsenic-doped ear. Hines, along with some other medical practitioners, became an outspoken critic of the use of arsenic pigment in Germany. Arsenical wallpapers had been banned, but not in the UK. The war, people manufacturers didn't want people to think there's anything wrong with their products, and they say, The Lancet and the British Medical Journal fought a long campaign to bring this in the public, so there was quite a lot of speed to what was going on. Some doctors and newspapers called on the British government to ban the poisonous paper, but others were quick to belittle the claims of the killer wallpaper. Some manufacturers even offered to eat it to prove how safe it was. One of Britain's most celebrated wallpaper designers was William Morris, a leading light of the arts and crafts movement. He was also one of the fiercest critics of the heartless industrialists of this period. But what is not well known about this champion of handicraft is that he was a director of the biggest arsenic-producing mine in the world. Devon Great Consols, William Morris was making with his money from arsenic. That's quite a surprise, isn't it? Because of course we associate Willie Morris as being, this leader of the arts and crafts movement as someone who's, going back to place, it's going to look back to natural things, but he's got this mind that potentially is certainly selling arsenic, whether he's using it as wallpapers, or sometimes we said there was enough arsenic produced from that mine to kill the entire planet and every creature on Earth. Some of the people who came out with the processes had vested interests in other locations that they would own. Arsenic mines. They would own areas where it was in their interest to include arsenic into payments, dyes, whatever they do, and really, Morris ever accept that he was doing this, or did he continue to deny it? Well, there's an interesting letter. There was a customer complaining that the wallpaper was poisoning him and his family. And basically, William Morris said there was witch fever. So that was this for sovereigns. We have, which in other words, he thought he was being accused of something that just wasn't sure. Well, he was just saying it was, these doctors were saying, the new article wallpapers were killing people and damaging people's health, and he was just saying, it's mumbo-jumbo. Basically what he was saying. Contrary to Morris's claims, the evidence building up became impossible to deny, but it would take intervention from the very top before things started to change. One of the tipping points of that recognition was when Queen Victoria herself had wallpaper of She'll Dream. And she had a diplomat who actually came to stay with her who fell ill overnight. And she was at the records show that she was quite put out to be perfectly honest. She'd been stood up early in the morning and he hadn't turned up. But axes the poor chap had actually killed overnight. He was actually effectively poisoned by the arsenic in the wallpaper. She was a little skeptical about it. But then they actually came out in the papers, and the world actually, quite a lot of publications around that time was actually that she'd done that. It was then that step change, and maybe we need to think, and how would regulate this? Unbelievably, the use of arsenic in wallpaper was never officially banned. But as consumers understood its danger, they stopped buying these wallpapers and forced commercial practice to change Morris wallpapers, and other astute manufacturers started to advertise their product as arsenic-free. Certainly by 1872. Even the star guides had switched to safer printing. But we'll never know how many died a slow death through the prevalence of arsenic in Victorian products. I cannot see that having this amount of arsenic dust fully around a Victorian home would not lead to chronic health problems. As a Class 1 carcinogen is a human carcinogen. So years of exposure to this would have led the cancer is basically the Victorian ideal, or perhaps fantasy of domesticity, was that the lady of the house should be, as Charles Dickens describes it, in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the ministering angel of domestic bliss. Victorian women were encouraged to make their home a reassuring sanctuary for their husbands, away from the jealousy, cares, and dangers of working life. The idea of the angel of the house was obviously a literary creation, but it tapped in completely to what the Victorians essentially wanted. It was a movement away from the fact that in the 18th century, usually father and mother had pitched in together in the business with a professionalization, the growth of factories. The home was away from the place of work, so the home became this ideal place of perfection and taste. This enclosed bubble of purity as the home became an ideal. It needed to be protected and nurtured, and therefore buying things for the home, creating things for the home came to be seen as the woman's occupation. The men went out, there conquering the empire. The women stayed at home and kept things pure. Music. Women were expected not only to create the perfect home, the lady of the house had to measure up as well. Our next danger in this house is in the bedroom. The pursuit of this feminine ideal wasn't entirely safe. Lurking in many beautifying products were harmful toxins. Part of being the ideal Victorian woman was looking just right, whatever your physique. One of these came in handy. In fact, this was essential. Corsets kept everything under control, and they meant self-reserve. And that was vital to the Victorian woman because the opposite was just excess and freedom and flesh flying everywhere. And once he did that, but the world might fall down. Sarah Nicole looks after one of the biggest corset collections in the country. So tell me about all the different layers we can see here. What is going on? First of all, we've got the chemise underneath, so you would never have worn your corset next to your skin. The corset predates the bra. Its function was to support the chest and help take the weight of up to 14 pounds of clothing. Would have had a petticoat as well, that's sort of 5 garments before. Yeah, you've even got to your outerwear, it is. Yes, the Symington factory manufactured corsets that were affordable for everybody. They did all of their own artwork and printing for all their box tops for their corsets. That is just beautiful. It may look beautiful, but women were unwittingly paying a terrible price in the 1860s and 70s. Corsetry became increasingly extreme by the mid-19th century. The ideal female form, the corseted female form, was everywhere, in newspapers, magazines, journals aimed at women, and this celebrity, the actresses had it, the dancers had it, but particularly fashion plates had it, this impossible figure. I mean, they were drawn simply because no woman would look like that. What kind of courses and how? Restrictive. They were dependent on your age, your class, your occupation, and are fashionable. It was recommended that a corset was to be worn at all times, and there was no escape. Not even in the colonies, Simons made this to market directly, outrages that were going to tropical regions. So they were either going with their man, or to get their man. It's called the ventilated corset. For obvious reasons, it has the center section removed. They're all women. Wearing this in all parts of the British Empire. Yeah, whatever the weather. Yes, and you were regarded as a loose woman. If you did not wear your corset, it demonstrated their character, and it demonstrated that they were fine and upright citizens and, fit for the British Empire. These robust cages of whalebone and steel were turned into potential killers by one surprisingly small technological advance, the metal eyelet. What it allows people, if they want to tight lace their corset without fabric pulling away. The metal eyelet made it easier to get. The look, because it was possible to lace tightly without the material tearing as it previously would have done, there was a fashion for wearing very, very, very tight policies. I mean, it's fascinating. You see in photographs the fabric pulls in a way that we would think means it doesn't fit. A tight lacing is something that a minority of people did, and that is to get your waist as small as you possibly can. They used to do this by lightly lacing their ties. Of course, it tighter and tighter. Some women would keep their corsets on day and night to train their bodies. Music. So, what are the effects of a corset on the body in the long term? Well, if I could just show you here the position of the normal organs. So, the liver, for example, our largest internal organ, sits underneath the ribs on the right, and so it's a large wedge-shaped organ that sits here under the ribs. And so, in a corset, which brings the ribs in very tightly to give the typical small-waisted outline, the liver gets squashed upwards and it presses against the ribs. And in fact, there are specimens of livers taken from women who have died, who've worn tight corsets, actually have ridges on them, where the ribs have made indentations in the surface of the liver because it's been so tight. And another organ that may be affected by a tight corset is a stomach that sits here at underneath the rib cage. And so, if the rib cage was pulled in by the corset, the stomach is pushed downwards into the abdominal cavity. And that would then have an effect on the rest of the abdominal organs, which would be pushed down. This is a pregnancy corset from 1885. Some women even wore corsets when pregnant. A particular choice came for women. About the course, it is what, when they fell pregnant, because many husbands complain, they didn't want their babies head-shaped and molded. But there were women who continued to wear corsets through pregnancy, which, you know, there's no way in it at all that is possibly good for the baby. One of the problems with corsets after pregnancy, particularly women had a lot of babies, was that of prolapse of the uterus. The pelvic floor muscles haven't been weakened during childbirth, and then a very tight corset that increases the pressure in the abdomen, forcing all the organs down. So that would have been a very unwanted side effect of wearing tight corsets. Now, it's my turn, a body a little bit tighter. Whether you can feel that, I've got you. Yeah, I can feel it. Yep. I confess I felt delighted to have a smaller waist result. I can see why they did it now. 24 inches look 24, 3-4. The Victorian household guides even advised on suitable exercises for a lady. I'm just exhausted. I'm etc. I'm not really that unfit, honestly. Or am I? We're going to use sport science equipment with Matt Ferber to measure the effect of the corset on my body. Yep, I'm happy. You happy? Yeah, first, I have to give him a baseline of fitness without the corset. I exercise for 6 minutes now. Matt monitors my vital signs with the corset on first, how it affects me at rest, and I repeat the same exercise with Matt, measuring my heart rate and airflow. Halfway through, and Matt's already seeing the changes I feel, close to fainting, and it takes 2 minutes for my head to clear, and I'm not even tight-laced. Okay, last 10 seconds. Excellent, you're free. So, what happened? What can science reveal about the effects of a corset? So in terms of the rate in which you're breathing, so even at rest you can see, so you've got, the red line is when you're wearing the corset, the blue lines, it's not wearing it, when you're not, when you're corset, so you see even at rest, when you're sitting down, you're breathing in the corset around about, 23, 24 breaths per minute. Whereas when you didn't have the corset on, you were down about 14 breaths a minute. So it shows that even at rest, of course, it's really restricting. And then when it actually comes to wash, right? When you do any exercise, and we can see where your figures, with the corset on your tidal volume. So the amount of air getting every breath is a lot lower. So you're breathing approximately 200 mils less every single breath with the corset on. Gosh. Yeah. So that's why, at the end, I felt like I was really fighting to get in there. Absolutely. Really, with these figures, you can really see the impact the course is. The restriction, of course, is you're basically hyperventilating within the course. It's kind of what's happening, because you're breathing an awful lot faster. 10 breaths per minute. It's an extra 25% faster. Wearing a corset, I've proved it's damaging. But could it be a killer that chronic underperfusion, not getting enough air down into the bottom of the lungs, could cause problems? It predisposes to infections like pneumonia. And that was something that a very tight corset worn for many hours a day could cause problems with. If a woman had an underlying problem, it could exacerbate it. So for example, if a young girl had rickets from vitamin D deficiency, to have soft bones that were still developing. and they could be distorted very much by wearing a tight corset. There are stories of the ribs breaking and piercing the lung underneath, which could be fatal. As the century wore on, the corset became the focus of a huge debate. Women, its possibilities for activity became much larger. Over the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, there was nothing unvirtuous in going around on your bicycle and walking freely. And so this wasn't very practical for them to be wearing corsets. Arena simply didn't work. And increasingly, women began to say, these are pointless. They're just getting in the way. I spending hours in the morning getting myself into the corset when I could be doing something far more useful. It really also coincided with the growth of the votes for women. The idea that women were equal citizens. So if they're equal citizens demanding the vote, they shouldn't be treated as some kind of excessive ornament that are there to be looked at and there to be admired and are ruining the health, just so they look white for men. The campaign for change was spearheaded by the rationale dress. Society established in 1881, Constance Wilde, wife of Oscar, edited the Rational Dress Gazette. The Rational Dress Society protests against the introduction of any fashion in dress that either deforms the figure, impedes the movement of the body, or in any way tends to injure health by the 1890s. Some manufacturers had started to respond to demands for looser clothing, yet one thing will probably never disappear: the temptation to conform to an ideal of beauty, whatever the cost. Why did women caring? Wearing corsets? Well, for exactly the same reason as I was delighted to have a 24-inch waist. It was psychologically rewarding, even if physically it could take its toll. The idea of that S-shaped figure, we are completely enthralled to it even now. So I don't think that we can really look back on the Victorians and say, oh my goodness, weren't they silly fainting when they sang Falling All Over the Place because they wore corsets? I don't think we can say without necessarily that far away, I'm on the trail of the next household danger. I'm heading to the kitchen. Corsets weren't just warmed by middle-class Byrne, they were also worn by their servants as they carried out household tasks. It almost beggars belief, but at least those servants benefited from the proliferation of new gadgets designed to make their lives easier and safer. Well, sort of. This was a brave new world where the ingenious Victorian inventor felt he had the answers to any domestic problem. But many of these inventions were difficult to use and proved to be dangerous, and people were untrained in how to use them. By the mid-1870s, the Victorians were bringing services into the home, piping in water and trying out new gas appliances and gadgets, and of all the new inventions available, what could be more desirable in these dark, damp houses than something that offered heat and light gas was to open a whole new chapter of Victorian household catastrophes. What we had in the past was everybody would be congregated around a single lamp, and it would be either oil or a candle or something else. And then, all of a sudden, people didn't want to live on top of each other all the time. We wanted to find better ways of doing it. And it was towards the end of the Victorian-era that they started bringing gas lighting that was actually capable of light in a whole room. It was a massive step forward. It was their fourth greatest innovation. You could have a room that was completely lit. They had coal gas, said something. It was called wood gas. And they had another material called a water gas. Now these were highly poisonous. There's no control. There was no Scott. It was just gas. The worst killer was because you couldn't actually smell it, so you'd have no idea until it was too late. Basically, he would just keel over, and that would be the end of you in the second half of the 19th century. The papers, everything from the Worcester Evening News to the Western Gazette, are full of stories of people dying horribly. These aren't headline cases, they're just little snippets that gives the facts and figures. So, for example, in the Manchester Evening News in 1886, there's a story of 5 boys suffocating in a loft, or this one from the Sheffield Independent, 1872. The lady was found confined in a bedroom with her infant in its nose, and it says she must have unconsciously deranged the joint of the gas stove, thus permitting an escape of gas. All 3 were found apparently lifeless. But why was such cases so widespread? It may seem obvious to us now, but at the time, The dangers of gas were not known to the man in the street, and the gas companies' adverts didn't help matters. Some of the major gas companies coming out with misnomers that gas was actually good for people, that you could actually have a room full of gas and walk in there with a naked light and it would be perfectly safe. Gas companies were popping up all over the place. You couldn't walk a block in, and without seeing a gas company, the rivalry was just huge. But of course, with rivalry comes cost cutting. What you also had at the time was unscrupulous activities going on between gas suppliers, where they would actually sabotage their opponents or their competitors by actually dropping the pressure to save money. Companies would reduce their own gas supply to customers. At night, the gas lab would actually just flicker away and then blow out in the middle of the night, and then the gases just seep into your home and he wouldn't be waking up in the morning. It was the heart of the industrial period. They wanted everything new, manufactured to be the scene, to be at the cutting edge of what was going on. And that was then how they drove. Innovation through making something, engineering. Something, if it wasn't engineered, it wasn't bit. The speed of change was breathtaking, but there was neither the time nor the will to test these products that would be sold to millions of consumers. One of the most brilliant contraptions in this age of scientific progress was a system that could provide warmth throughout the whole house. A massive improvement on open coal fires and drafty chimneys. Gas central heating was a huge thing. In 1800s, they came up with the idea of a sealed system. Ovid, it would heat water exactly same as a steam train. Basically, a huge cylinder. It was very volatile. The pressure inside these boilers was just absolutely phenomenal. They were running them all around houses. You could have 10, 12, 15, 16 radiators on each system. But of course, you could be sitting down the Vanir lunch and this steam, well, doesn't open. You could be tucking into your turtle soup, and the next thing is a huge explosion, and you'll be leaving the building without opening the door. The pressure was just huge, so it was only ever going to end up in one story. Really, it was gonna be an accident and people will die. The main problem was that they didn't understand the dangers of what they were doing. Gas and cast iron hadn't been used in this way in the home before, when they weren't doing the casting. It was at the very forefront of that technology of understanding that weaknesses and flaws in that car, in that casting, could actually cause problems further down the line. The inventive Victorian engineer, having tackled heat and light, now turned his attention to cooking stoves. What could be so dangerous about a stove like this with an open system, when you add the coal and the massive flue with the smoke pouring up the chimney? Ventilation was superb because the air would run through the kitchen straight up the chimney, take all the smoke away. But when they sort of encompassed it into a sealed container, and problems were pressure, and that problems were getting rid of the smoke, because there's the actual ventilation and the draft there. Wasn't one to go through the system to take the smoke away, so inevitably the kitchens become really smoky. And of course, this could lead to anything to suffocation. If you avoided suffocating in the smoky kitchen, you still had a potential problem. They made sealed units and poured hot water into them and used them, sort of, that like the modern-day kettle. And of course, this was a boil as a boiling pot. And of course, there's no release valves or anything like that. Of course, these stoves were just exploding. It was like a small-time bomb. There's totally scene eliminated. They didn't understand the pressures and what happened when you introduced oxygen. And you had these huge catastrophic explosions in kitchens. Towards the end of the Victorian era, a new power source gradually came into play. They were starting to turn away from gas because it was so volatile and go towards electricity, basically. But Alex he was a killer as well. It wasn't 100% safe when they were, first coming up with these ideas of bottles put huge pressure on women to abandon breastfeeding. And there were these bottles that have these kind of fantastic empire names. The Empire bottle. They're really suggesting that for a woman to choose the bottle. I mean, brilliant marketing ploy to choose the bottle made her a much better citizen of empire. She was essentially doing the right thing for her children. But could this be hidden? Killer doctor Matthew Averson is a microbiologist. He's going to use his scientific expertise to cast an eye on this Victorian innovation. I have brought you this is a Victorian baby's bottle. What's wrong with this? I think the obvious thing just looking at it, because of this bend on the side of it, it's very difficult to actually clean away any residue that might be forming in here, and also the stopper being made of rubberin. The tube in there all porous materials, so they would accumulate residue of milk, and any bacteria that might be in that would permeate into the porous material, and you'd end up very quickly with bacteria growing in. That there's the bottle, and then there's either a rubber or an animal skin nipple which says Mrs. Beaten is book you tie on, and then you don't have to take off for the 2 or 3 weeks it lasts. So apart from outside, it never gets washed. Sounds disgusting. But what are the dangers of using porous materials with milk? Matthews designed an experiment. He contaminates a piece of porous cork and a piece of non-porous plastic with a bacteria that would have been common in Victorian times. He gives them each a quick wash and drops them into a liquid that mimics the contents of the Victorian bottle. The shaping of the incubator introduces oxygen into the samples, which makes them grow up faster, and it also heats them up to a body. Temperature 37 degrees just gives us a quicker result whilst we wait for the result. What was going into the Victorian baby bottle breast pumps existed. So, mother is milk and a nutritious formula. According to the food manufacturers, the things that were recommended. I mean what Mrs. Beaton's doctor calls farinaceous foods, which are foods were their formula that's sold in shops. But he's basically flour. You know, the children didn't thrive for very obvious reasons to us that they have an idea about bacteria in the 1890s, say, when this feeding bottle was invented. What's around about that time, scientists are going to have made discoveries about the link between the bacterial colonization of substances and disease. So there are many examples of that. For example, the cholera epidemics in London were stamped out by separation of sewage and water, and that had happened by that time. But it's just whether that information had permeated down to the domestic level. So what does our experiment proved? Okay. These are the results of the samples are inoculated last night. You can clearly see that the one with the cork is much denser. You get a much denser growth than on the plastic. This just shows that there were many more bacteria on the cork than on the plastic, and the bacteria have come from the pores within the cork. It illustrates the idea that when you have a porous material, it's soaked. So bacteria, even in a few hours, you're going to get enough bacteria to cause an infection. So, I mean, what does this mean for our babies? Bottle? Yeah, I think they didn't really understand that porous materials would retain the bacteria even if they were washed over the surface like this core could be. And so therefore, if new media is put on new milk, new food, it's going to take up the bacteria again and cause this effect Victorian. Britain was alive with killer diseases that sound tropical now, but will common them things like dysentery and typhoid. These are all very serious intestinal diseases passed on through dirty water, which was then drunk. The cycle completes itself, and you end up with serious diarrhea infections. And for a small baby, dehydration very quickly would lead to death within 48 hours. Absolutely, the lack of knowledge of transmission of germs in water meant that bottle-fed children were more at risk. In addition to that, there are lots of bacteria that live in the mouth and in the upper respiratory tract in the back of the throat. These bacteria are fine if they're there. But if they were to get inhaled into the lungs, there could cause pneumonia. And of course, when you're sucking on something like this, there's a potential for any bacteria like that to effectively be inhaled in small droplets. If they get into the lungs, they can cause a lower respiratory tract infection, what we call pneumonia. And of course, infant pneumonia was the biggest cause of death in babies, and those bacteria from the upper respiratory tract getting down there, causing that pneumonia, could potentially be lethal again very quickly and with no cure. So that's not just one bacteria. It's sort of one danger. There's loads of them, dozens of them. We're all covered in billions, trillions of bacteria. What we provide in here is a place for those bacteria to get an itch to grow, multiply into excessive quantities, and then an access routes straw into a very vulnerable individual. And that is why these things undoubtedly would have killed many children. So the dirtiest, most bacteria-ridden, deadliest object of all went straight into the mouths of babes. Doctors came to understand the dangers of bacteria and its growth. A step forward was made in 1894. With Allen and Ham Bree's double-ended feeder bottle, the design had a teat at one end and a valve at the other. This enabled the flow of milk to be constant, but more importantly, it was easy to clean and therefore safer. Despite this, the old dangerous bottles sold well into the 20th century. It may be true that our hidden killers, the poisonous wallpaper killer corsets, dangerous paint, exploding stoves, and infested babies, bottles damaged the Victorians' prized ideal of the safe and secure home. Yet this was an extraordinary age, so full of innovations, even if there was a price to pay. History, as ever, is a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And although progress was not without sacrifice, we still have their legacy. We still live in their houses. We may think that we are overregulated today, that health and safety has gone too far. But when we think about what things were like just over 100 years ago, we should be grateful that the Victorians not only pioneered new products, but also protections against them. It makes me wonder what we are oblivious to today. Light bulbs, and because you mix electricity with gas, so you bring in electric lights, and we've still got the gas. Caca, and these gas cookers were left on, the joint still corroded, broke down and let gas escape, and of course you'd come down in the morning into any wonderful new electric light, Don, and that's the first thing that explodes is your gas cooker. So the two of them, that they were not to go together. It was a recipe for disaster. Again, it wasn't until 1923 that any safety regulations were brought in, but the benefits of a warm, cozy home meant that most were willing to risk the consequences. Invention was running 100 miles an hour, and we just weren't quick enough to keep up with all the fitters. Over your Bruins, skilled enough to keep up with it. But the amount of deaths that happened through negligence, not just through not understanding what the material here using, was huge. I'm leaving the dangers of the kitchen, and I'm going to the one place in the house where you'd think health and safety would be particularly cherished, the nursery, to seek out the next hidden killer. The new consumer culture even extended as far as providing entertainment for children. Surely, that wouldn't be a problem. Would it, alarmingly, despite all the progress, 154,000 infants under the age of 1 died annually between 1880 and 1890. And so a surviving child was an important one, and their interests were indulged. Charles's was expanded more than ever before. I mean, girls were home for a very long time. Virtuous young ladies, Lord Shaftesbury saying children shouldn't work excessively in factories. The idea of childhood became sac result in the Victorian world. This meant a new consumer market to target. Manufacturers absolutely poured goods for the child into the shops, and we will snap them up. This was the time when Christmas was essentially invented as a child's festival, at the time when children received presents and children was spoiled. But it was this indulgence that was now endangering children, and toys were the problem. Anything that was colored or pigmented would have had high levels of a toxic metal in it. And even if I was white, it wasn't. See, if those large levels of lead in white painted objects, lead is a very poisonous substance, and there's no amount of lead that is safe for your body. Even the tiniest amount of it can be detrimental. And obviously children being much smaller, and also because they're developing, and later damages the nervous system, are much more susceptible to lead poisoning. And unfortunately, it is typically children who were poisoned by lead, partly because it was used for things like lead soldiers and for painting children as toys, but also because as the children's habit of licking and putting things in their mouths, anything they would chew or lick or would potentially flake off on them. And they get handled, put on their hands, then put her hands, and, oh nice, little flakes are lead. Unlike a lot of poisons which have an unpleasant taste, lead is not unpleasant. And so just by licking it wouldn't put a child off. So why on earth were the Victorians putting lead in paint? It's been known to be poisonous since Roman times. Quite simply, it was and remains the best preserver of wood. They had no idea that its poison could be transferred from a toy into a child's body. Some of the first abnormalities that might be found would be developmental ones. So the child may not develop as normal and may have behavioral problems. Things that might have been put down to temper tantrums. Or nowadays, something like an attention deficit disorder may actually have been due to lead poisoning, almost impossible to identify if you can't test levels of lead, because it's just the way in which that particular child is developing. And who knows what their potential would have been had they not been exposed. To lead wasn't just brought into the house on objects, it was in the very fabric of the home on painted surfaces. Laird was ubiquitous in the Victorian house for providing white gloss paints that you might find on every wooden, painted item would have been used with LED. We have a look at this piece of woodwork and see what's present, and this is, what we can see immediately is quite all Laird. It's 3,000 ppm of Laird, not because it's been stripped, it's probably just against traces of all LED paint before the old pin broke was taken off in the late 19th century. Lead poisoning was rife, but it was difficult to detect lead poisoning cause anemia. And it's often described that people had a gray pallor as at a very unhealthy look, but one way, which is identified by physician Dr. Henry Burton in 1840, was something called Burton-Adly lines, which was a bluey-gray line at the base of the gums, just at the top of the teeth. They gave a very characteristic mark that was a sign of lead poisoning, although by the time you identified that line, it was probably too late to undo some of the effects that the lead is likely to have had by then. Despite the gruesome evidence, the government did nothing. It was not until the 1920s that white LED was banned in indoor paint products in Sweden, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland, Spain, Finland, and Norway, but not Britain. Amazingly, it wasn't until the 1970s, more than 100 years after the problem had been identified, that the British government finally passed legislation to control the lead content of household paint. Even today, lead paint in old houses still poses a risk, but there was an even bigger threat. I'm on the hunt for our last and possibly our greatest hidden killer, and again, one invisible to the Victorian eye: infant mortality rates in Victorian Britain were terrifyingly high. As many as 15% of all babies died in their first year of life, and often the cause was an unexpected one. Mommy's little helper baby, signs the idea that babies could be studied and developed in the most healthy way was the new order of the day. In the 18th century, the idea was that God took the children he wanted. There was very high infant mortality, and it was up to God. So you just let it go. In the 19th century, it was much about science, and women could be seen as responsible, and they were judged by how many of their children stayed alive, just like the Queen. You had 9 children, kept them all alive, who lived long and happy lives. The relationship between traditional ideas and the new scientific approach became increasingly fraught around how to feed babies. To comprehend how this domestic danger had such an impact requires understanding the Victorian attitudes. To baby rearing, breastfeeding had long been rather unpopular in the high rarest aqua. See, the Queens didn't breastfeed, it was something that I was requested. Women simply didn't do. They gave the job to wet nurses, big, fat, jolly wet nurse, rather than the Victorian woman who was supposed to be much more delicate, much more refined, and much more restrained. This attitude filtered into the new swelling middle classes. One figure loomed large over the household guides to bringing up baby: Mrs. Beeton, and it was her they turned to for advice. Mrs. Beeton gives 2 chapters in her book, which was enormous, lie influential to baby and child care, and it tells you all the useful tips about breastfeeding, like drink lots of beer. Although it does, they stay off the gin, but after that, it then moves on to what to do. If, for whatever reason, you cannot breastfeed your child, any new idea needs explain in detail. Feeding babies by bottle was a new idea. The problem with this advice: it takes up much more space in the book, so it seems as though it is actually recommending bottle feeding, or as it was known in the 19th century, rearing by hand. But many saw this as Mrs. Beeton promoting bottle feeding, her perceived support, and the marketing of babies.